Welcome to EDI on BIV. I'm Hayley Woodin, Executive Editor at Business in Vancouver. Today we're discussing progressive Aboriginal relations and how relationships between Indigenous businesses and the broader corporate community in Canada can be improved. My co-host on the show today is Chastity Davis-Alphonse, a multi-award-winning Indigenous relations strategic advisor and the founder of Chastity Davis Consulting. She's also the editor of BIV's upcoming Indigenous Business magazine coming out in June. Chastity, thanks for joining us once again on the show.
Thanks for having me, Hayley. Happy to be here.
And we're speaking today with Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which, among other things, runs the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program, or PAR program, a premier corporate social responsibility program in Canada. Tabatha, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Why don't we start with this idea of progressive Aboriginal relations? How do you define that? What does that mean to you in CCAB?
Sure, thank you. So Progressive Aboriginal Relations is a trademark program that actually is in its 20th year this year. It is a program that corporations undertake looking across their whole organization. So there's a set of certain criteria, and they look across under 4 pillars. Employee development. So not just how many Indigenous employees do we have, but are we creating a safe space in our interviewing? Are we ensuring there's no bias within interviewing? Are we ensuring there's an opportunity for Indigenous employees to rise up within the organization? And also, what does our leadership look like in terms of Indigenous people? Business development, which would be things like procurement. So do we have a policy to ensure that we're procuring from Indigenous business? Are there potential mentorship programs that they can do to support Indigenous business, or perhaps partnership programs? So actually entering into equity partnerships with Indigenous communities or businesses. Community relations. So that's, definitely for resource extraction companies, very different in how they're really working with the communities that they may be impacting, or again, potentially partnering with them. But then we also have businesses that are in the program that maybe not as much impactful from a community land perspective, but really just wanting to understand how they can do better with Indigenous people across the country. And then leadership actions. So those might be things like encouraging their suppliers to go through the PAR program, or encouraging their suppliers to ensure that they have a procurement strategy as well. And the program, so it's about 3 years to go through this commitment process. And the important thing is that it's first, you have a working group that's across your whole organization. So it doesn't just sit within EDI or HR. You would have representatives on your working group across your organization, and you have leadership buy-in and commitment to the program as well. So I, prior to coming to CCAB, led the First Nation and Métis relations team at Ontario's electricity operator. And I had a very small team. It's an organization of over 700 people, but I had about 5 people on my team. And in that area, it's very difficult to make sure that there's an Indigenous lens put on every communication that goes out, that HR is really looking at that. So I know from experience that this working group from the top is so important. So the other really important part is that it's about setting your own intention. So every organization looks at that criteria and decides where they can really make an impact. So it's more, not one size fits all. It's really about what an organization believes they can do. Then they put those into practice. And in the 3rd year, they have up to 3 years to put that all into practice, their programs, measure against that. And then we have independent to CCAB Indigenous verifiers that go into the organization, speak with Indigenous employees, speak with the communities they're working with, speak with leadership, look at if they've made a commitment to procurement, how they've done on that. And then they recommend a level of certification to Indigenous, again, independent of CCAB jurors. And then you'd have a level certification of bronze, silver, or gold. So we have about 36 businesses that are certified, but total 145 across Canada in the program right now. So it's been in a real couple of years of growth in the last 2 years, which I think is, as all organizations are looking at EDI, it's been really exciting.
That's great. And I like that it's a 3-year commitment, because to me that suggests that systemic change within an organization, it's not going to happen overnight, that it takes time and you have to do the work, and it's going to take 3 years until you can get to a certain level.
Yeah, I think it's so important that it's a journey, right? Everybody's on this journey of understanding what their organization can do, and working with the community and their Indigenous people that work there to understand, what is best and what would make a brave, safe space. So the other is that every 2 years, corporations have to recertify. So it's not like you can get a gold certification and just have that forever. You really need to continue to demonstrate that you're meeting the criteria.
Yes, that's great. In my career, early in my career, I was with a big corporation and took part in the PAR process. And it is quite in depth. And I did feel like it encourages corporations to really take a deep dive into looking at progressive Indigenous relations and all those areas that Indigenous peoples and truth and reconciliation can be woven in. So a fan of the program for sure. You did quote some numbers of about 146 companies have taken part. To what extent do you feel that corporate Canada has adopted what you would consider to be progressive Indigenous relations? So there's 146, but what else do you think can be done, or where do you think corporations can take part?
I think we've seen some really great progress, and I know we talk a lot, or CCAB's talked a lot about some of those organizations that are already certified. So Suncor as an example, BC Hydro, OPG, so energy sector, of course, and all of the major banks. And I think the part of that also is that there's this really commitment to procurement. And we also see that having such a huge impact on the communities and businesses that they work with. And the really exciting part of that is the intergenerational wealth that's created. So recently, I have these coffee connection meetings just with once a month with our members. And recently we had a young woman there who had started her own business, and she spoke about remembering when her dad started his own business, and he did that because Suncor had a procurement policy to support Indigenous business. And she said if that hadn't happened and he didn't have a business, she probably wouldn't have finished high school, and she definitely wouldn't have been a business owner herself. So I think that is so important, is that generational wealth that procurement policies like that create. But we're seeing really incredible also interest from tech sector. So Uber, as an example, is now going through the PAR program. So that's a new organization, fairly new organization. But they really came to us and wanted to understand what they could do. Like, what more could they do to support Indigenous business and Indigenous people? And I think also there's a pressure now on corporations to demonstrate their values, and not just for the consumer to attract good consumers, but also to attract talent. Young people definitely are wanting to work for a company whose values align with theirs. So I think there's two things. I think some corporations are definitely doing it because they believe in it and their leaders do, but then there's also corporations who are really knowing that they're going to have to attract the consumer and to attract good talent.
Would you say this program is one that lends itself to businesses of all sizes and across all sectors, or is it better suited to, say, large organizations in certain sectors?
So actually we, and maybe Chastity, when you were through the program, it was quite intense and it was a lot of work, but it should be a lot of work. It's not, about just signing a declaration to say that you're committed. It really does need to be work. You have to put the work in. But we have revised the program a little bit. So we introduced this commitment portion that has 3 phases to really help businesses through the process so they understand the different phases of that program. But then recently we introduced a PAR for small business. So for businesses that have a smaller number of employees with a lesser amount of criteria, because we were hearing from smaller businesses that it was quite a big process for them to be able to go through if they only had 5 employees, but they wanted to understand how they could do better, and a guided process is something that's so much more helpful. So we have recently adopted that, and we are also looking at developing PAR for government so that we can work with ministries and organizations within government to also support them in understanding where across their organizations they can do better in their relationships with business and people and Indigenous leaders.
And have you launched the government portion yet, or do you have a timeline for that? And also interested in if there's been any initial interest or uptake for that program.
So we've had a couple conversations with government, and there is interest. We're looking at more doing a bit of a pilot to see how it will work. Just with governments changing every 3 years with every election, how does that work for a certification portion of it? So we have had interest though from a couple of different ministries in the federal government, and we've had some conversations with some provincial governments as well. So which is really exciting to see. So we're hoping to launch a bit of a pilot with a couple organizations just to test it out, and then go a little bit more public.
I want to ask you too, as you evolve the program to meet varying needs or take advantage of other opportunities, are you also redefining what it means to be progressive? So hopefully as what was yesterday's progressive becomes more standard, are you constantly looking ahead to sort of redefine the new standards that we should all be striving toward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on its own, it naturally or organically becomes that way, partially because businesses have to recertify, but then also there is a bit of a competition. You know, if one bank gets gold and the other bank doesn't, or if we see, you know, within certain sectors, it kind of creates this like, okay, I need to do better, and what could I do? And then definitely we see when someone is certified and maybe they're certified silver, those companies are so invested that they're going right back to the drawing board to say, like, how do we get gold next time? How can we continue to do better? And I think, as we said at the beginning, it's such a journey, the path on what you're doing. And I think even with truth and reconciliation, it's a journey. It's about learning a truth and then reconciling that, and then learning another truth and reconciling that. So I think we see that progression happen as well across a number of different organizations. And I think also because we see new sectors, so educational institutions and companies like Uber and IT companies, they have an opportunity, or maybe looking at it from a different lens, to do something new. And then that kind of circles back to the other organizations also.
What a great thing, though, to have companies competing to be more and more progressive and to one up each other in that way, though. That's a great sort of definition of progress.
Yeah, I'll also say, and this is a huge, that's kind of happened just 2 days ago. So we have done some work with Shareholders Research Group and NATOA, the National Aboriginal Trust Association, looking at investors' ability to push for Indigenous inclusion. And the shareholders of both Sun Life and most recently TMX just yesterday voted on a shareholder resolution to ensure that TMX has an Indigenous inclusion policy, and that they go through some type of program similar to PAR. And 98% of the shareholders voted in favor. So I think when we see organizations like TMX come on board and really start to try to understand how they can do better, that's going to, like, across the financial sector, make such a big impact. And we see other real leaders in that space. So Deloitte, as an example, had already developed, which was called a reconciliation action plan. And this is something that they have in Australia. Many corporations have to have a reconciliation action plan in Australia, and they have to post it publicly as well on their website. So Deloitte has already done that, but now they're going through the PAR process as well, just to realign the work that they're doing. And I have to apologize for my dog. You can hear that.
It's all good. It's part of the COVID working from home reality. So thank you so much for sharing. All of that is super exciting. And you're talking about the impact through the business community and the impact that's happening through the corporations. I'm interested in hearing your perspective on how those impacts trickle down into community and Indigenous peoples.
So the stats on the communities in the Fort McMurray area, oil sands area, is that the average income is $75,000 a year. And if you look at the average income in Alberta, it's closer to around 46. So as I said, those stats are a little bit old, and definitely we know the impact that has happened of late with COVID and on the oil and gas sector in Alberta. So we are looking at redoing that type of study to really understand that impact of procurement and supporting and employing Indigenous people in the community. I think the other definitely is the opportunity for Indigenous youth to be able to see their leaders in roles within a corporation that are more senior, and to also see the leaders within their community own their own businesses and be able to support the community through their business. The other thing is we know from our research at CCAB, and this is probably well known as well, but that particularly Indigenous women entrepreneurs, over 70% of them say that supporting their community and their relationship with their community is their most important relationship in their business plan. And we also know that Indigenous businesses have within their values sustainability and environment and giving back to their community, which I think now that ESG is such a popular conversation, it is a bit of, Indigenous people have been doing this since we started trading with settlers in a business way. So I think that as we see more Indigenous businesses grow across the country, it's going to have a positive impact both on the community and the environment across Canada.
I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Tabatha, in the interest of, say, trying to facilitate greater representation of Indigenous businesses and leaders within the economy on boards within workplaces. Do you subscribe to the idea that having mandatory requirements would be helpful, or do you think that voluntary programs that are really great, like PAR, for example, get us there enough and there's enough interest from the business community in participating on a voluntary basis?
It's a good question. And I did have the opportunity to participate in the federal government's program, the 50-30 Challenge, in developing that program. And I'm now working on what that means with some incredible leaders at Ryerson and Diversity Institute. I think on boards, a mandatory requirement or moving towards a mandatory requirement on corporate boards is definitely possible. And I think we do need that. As much as, PAR is voluntary and we do see a big influence there and huge growth there and growth in our membership as well. So both Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses are members of CCAB and our membership is growing even during this last year of COVID. So I think there is definitely an interest, but I think the board part about just board governance and that it's so common that everybody on the board is from someone it's always like a few degrees of separation, even though that's not the best governance, but you kind of go to your network when you're looking for people that are on a board. And there are so many incredible Indigenous leaders out there and Indigenous PhDs and that, but they're just not in that network of corporate Canada yet. So I think we need to actively require that corporations seek out and find Indigenous leaders. The last time that the corporate boards had to declare their board diversity. So there was only 7 Indigenous leaders on corporate boards in Canada that had to declare, which I think was over 230 or so businesses that had to declare, and that's 7 leaders. So if you think an average of like 10 people on a board, it's like 7 of 2,300 spots or more. And I was reading the report last fall, and I turned to my husband and I was like, I could probably name those people. And not that, I definitely don't know every possible incredible Indigenous leader out there, but we just so often see the same common incredible Indigenous people. But I think also if we don't start to spread that network and grow that network, we're going to overburden those few people. And we need to really be bringing up more. In terms of executive leadership, I think that's more of a goal, because I really think there needs to be an opportunity for people to be promoted within an organization and to grow into those leadership roles, rather than organizations feeling they had a requirement to bring in from outside. I think organizations need to be looking at, like, how are we growing Indigenous people within our organization? So that's going to take a little bit more time. And I think every organization needs to have the flexibility to be able to figure out how they're going to do that.
Thank you, Tabatha. I have the last question here, and I'm interested in hearing about your vision, or CCAB's vision, for the Progressive Aboriginal Relations program and or economic reconciliation.
Thanks. So, definitely on par. It's been my kind of dream that we would see on the TSX stock exchange everybody's PAR certification level, so that people know if they're investing in an organization, how they are working with Indigenous people and on economic reconciliation. And apparently that's not that hard. So I did have the opportunity to speak with the CEO of TMX before the shareholder meeting, and he was pretty positive at that maybe not on the TSX in the newspaper, but that we could definitely let investors know. I think also on par, it would be incredible long-term to see again an investment opportunity, like a mutual fund of organizations that we know are doing well with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. And then as an investor, I could say, I want to invest in those companies because I believe in what they're doing. I think also we need to think about ESG and ESG goals and where Indigenous relations fits into that. Some people are talking about ESGI, but really when you think about ESG, Indigenous culture and values fit into each of those. So I think we need to have a bit more of that conversation. And then also we are as Indigenous national organizations, so together with NACA, which is the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, and NIDB, National Indigenous Economic Development Board, ourselves and Indigenous Works and Can Do are putting together a national Indigenous economic strategy that will have a series of calls to economic prosperity that anyone could answer. So kind of similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but really talking about economic development and how do we create that generational wealth and own source revenue in communities. So I'm really looking forward to what will come out of that.
That sounds very exciting. I encourage listeners to head on over to the ccab.com website to learn more about PAR and what we've been talking about. And Tabatha, really quickly, before we let you go, you mentioned before we hit record an event coming up. So maybe you can share what that is with our listeners.
Yes, thank you, Hayley. So we have our Indigenous Women in Leadership Award event on June 17th. It's, of course, a virtual event, but it's our 5th year of awarding this award. And this year it's going to Chief Tammy Cook-Searson. But we are really excited that our previous award winners are coming back. So Jody Wilson-Raybould, Roberta Jameson, Nicole Boucher, and Deborah Saucier. And they will all be coming back and talking about their journeys to where they are. And then we'll have a really great discussion with them as well, sharing with the new leader, which so important that we continue to hold up our matriarchs and women in our culture and really to shine a light on that strength. So I'm really looking forward to that and so pleased that they all agreed to return as well.
Sounds like an amazing event. And Tabatha, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and join our EDI on BIV podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Chi Miigwech.
That's Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, joining us today on the show. My co-host, Chastity Davis-Alphonse, the founder of Chastity Davis Consulting. And this has been EDI on BIV. I'm Hayley Woodin. Thanks so much for joining us. We publish new episodes of our show every Tuesday, so check back in with us next week.